Welcome. I'm very appreciative of this opportunity to share some of the stories related to the founding and creation of the Morton Arboretum with you. My name is Rita Hassert, and I am the Library Collections Manager in the amazing Sterling Morton Library. Before we dive into the stories, I'd like to thank you for your support of the Morton Arboretum. As a perennial partner, you've directly supported our work at the Arboretum for more than 10 years. Your support is truly outstanding. We are so fortunate to have you engage in the Arboretum's mission and legacy. Thank you. Today's presentation is entitled Stories from the Stacks of the Sterling Morton Library. Every story needs a starting point, a beginning. So just like one of these mighty oaks found growing at the Morton Arboretum, these massive trees each started out with just one small acorn. Like many plants, with lots of water, soil, light, as well as lots of good care, these seedlings developed into something wonderful and grand. So how do we understand how the Arboretum developed? What were some of the changes that have taken place to this landscape that we all know so well? Are there buildings or gardens from the Arboretum's past that are still visible today? It's my perspective that the Arboretum's history is all around us and waiting to be discovered. We just need to be curious as we look deeply, ask questions, and study our surroundings. To understand the Arboretum of today, it helps to explore some of the artifacts and documents left by our predecessors. Honestly, exploring Arboretum history doesn't require a crystal ball or even expertise in magic. As you can imagine, it's a little bit like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, trying to fit the pieces together by first connecting all the little bits of sky or all the pieces along the edge. Through the years, staff of the Sterling Morton Library have wrangled letters, files, photographs, maps, plans, and a host of other resources and documents that record the history of the Arboretum. Our archives provides appropriate housing for hundreds of linear feet of boxes, binders, and files, each of which contains such things as letters, historic images, and other documents recounting, describing, and illuminating the Arboretum's past. From this photograph's caption, we learned that Ed Westover, with a mule team, was moving a tree with a frozen root ball and something called a stone boat in 1923. Also, on the back of the photograph, it says that they moved as many as 1,500 trees per winter with frozen root balls during that time. Or how they built roads. In this photograph, we see workers covering freshly sprayed asphalt roadbed with gravel in the early 1930s. Or how they dug lakes. This is Arbor Lake excavation looking southwest, October 1957. Or how they painstakingly planted the prairie in the early 1960s. In this photograph, we see Ray Schulenberg and a colleague planting the prairie. You might notice the long board in this photograph. When planting, Ray would often use a board to kneel or sit on to distribute his weight and to discourage soil compaction. Such dedication. Or how the Arboretum came about. So let's start with the Arboretum's founder, Joy Morton, shown here wielding a shovel during a visit to the Dawes Arboretum in Ohio in 1927. Growing up on the plains of Nebraska, Joy Morton came from what I would describe as a tree-loving family. As an example, the Morton family thought trees were so important that their family motto was, as shown on this barn, plant trees. So let's begin with Joy Morton, the Arboretum's founder. He was born in 1855 and educated in Nebraska with brief study at a business school in Detroit. His formal schooling lasted only until he was 15, but by the time he left school, he had gained practical experience managing the family farm while also hauling goods by wagon train between Nebraska City and Lincoln and working on a railway survey crew. Like most successful Chicagoans of the latter half of the 19th century, Joy was not a native, but unlike him, he spent his early years in the pioneer West, not in the settled East. In his early 20s, Joy Morton took a job working for the railroads, first in Omaha and later in Aurora, Illinois, arriving there in 1878. His younger brother, Paul, was already living in Chicago and through some business contacts recommended Joy for a partnership with a salt marketing firm, E.I. Wheeler and Company. By age 25, Joy had saved enough money to become engaged to be married and to invest in a junior partnership with the firm. After E.I. Wheeler died unexpectedly in 1895, Morton was able to purchase the firm and renamed it Joy Morton and Company. He soon set about extending the scope of the company's operation and began to invest in salt evaporation plants in Michigan, and the company grew. Prior to 1905, the offices of Joy Morton and Company could be found at the Illinois Central Pier at Lake Michigan in a very handsome yet cramped quarters, which was a wooden replica of the first Boston public building designed by one of his ancestors, Thomas Joy. This is another view of the offices of Joy Morton and Company, showing the close proximity with the office building, the warehouses, the pier, and the lake. In the ensuing years, while Joy pursued careers in banking, agriculture, railroads, and business, becoming known as the founder of the Morton Salt Company, he also continued an active interest in trees. In 1905, the offices of Joy Morton and Company moved to the newly constructed Railway Exchange Building at Michigan Avenue and Jackson Boulevard, overlooking the Illinois Central Railroad tracks, a sliver of land known as Grant Park, and the lake beyond. The Railway Exchange Building, designed by Daniel Burnham and financed by the Standard Office Company over which Joy presided, marked a pivotal point in his relationship with his adopted city. Joy Morton and Company occupied the 7th floor, and Daniel Burnham's architectural firm was on the 14th. Even today, isn't the interior spectacular? Some of us might be more familiar with how this building has looked in its later years. During the early years, there were a number of big developments for Morton Salt. The first of these developments was the introduction of magnesium carbonate in 1911. Up to that point, commercial table salt was notorious for clumping together in humid conditions. As the first major manufacturer to recognize that magnesium carbonate could safely counteract this effect and enable salt to flow freely anywhere, anytime, Morton launched a revolution. They capitalized further by creating a new container with a pour spout and a blue paper label. Development number 2. According to company lore, Morton rejected several pitches from an advertising agency before jumping on the idea that became the slogan, "When it rains, it pours," a clever reference to the aforementioned fact that Morton salt wouldn't cake together when humidity rose. From this concept, the first Morton girl with her yellow dress and umbrella emerged. For all its mighty conveniences, though, the addition of magnesium carbonate probably did considerably less for the public good than the introduction of another new ingredient in 1924, iodine. During the early 1920s, it was discovered that adding iodine to commercial salt, table salt, could help combat one of the major public health problems of the time, which was goiters. Since goiters were linked to iodine deficiencies, particularly in high-risk regions throughout the Midwest, making small doses of iodine more readily available in an affordable, everyday food additive seemed the ideal course of action. By the fall of 1924, they became the first company to sell iodized salt nationally, and it quickly emerged as a new prominent selling point. A parallel story was developing at the time in Joy Morton's life. On a trip to Boston in 1873, when Joy was almost 18, he visited Harvard's Arnold Arboretum, founded the previous year. Almost 50 years later, the Arnold's director, Charles Sprague Sargent, became Joy Morton's chief advisor for his own arboretum. Joy Morton chose Lisle as the site of his country estate in 1909 as a retreat from the business of running Morton Salt in Chicago. An early enthusiast of the automobile, Morton took motoring trips throughout the Midwest, including through DuPage County, in part to seek a good piece of land to buy. His brother Mark had already purchased farmland just south of Wheaton. Many of you might be familiar with Mark's former estate. He eventually sold it to a couple named Dan and Ada Rice. As the story goes, in 1909, Joy Morton was out motoring with a friend, Edwin Potter, and noticed a small prairie fire. Morton and Potter, along with their driver, exited the car in order to assist the farmer with the fire. Once the fire was out, Morton found himself standing on a hillside overlooking the DuPage River Valley, and Morton knew he had found the location he was seeking. He soon arranged to purchase the hillside and the woods and the farmland surrounding this site. Named in honor of the hawthorn trees growing on the hill, Thornhill was designed by architect Jarvis Hunt, with initial construction of the home beginning in 1910. In addition to the house, Thornhill, a farm was developed around the site, with plans for fields and pastures that of course would include barns, sheep, geese, and not of the Canadian variety, where crops were raised and hay was cut and baled. Also, over these years, the house on the hill grew and grew and grew. Since few of us would have visited the inside of the Morton's home, I thought these 3 photographs might be of interest. This first photograph is of the entryway in Thornhill. The next photo is of a dining room. Initially, I was surprised by the size of the dining room table, but based on the dimensions of the carpet, I suspect that for larger dinner parties, this small table had multiple leaves added to it. And finally, this was a small seating area in the home. In addition to the farm developing around his home, Joy Morton was also planning to develop an arboretum. So, how does one actually go about creating an arboretum? Even today, many of us would want to go to an expert. We've been digitizing the Morton family correspondence in our collection. I think you'll see from the next couple of letters, it was a family affair, but not everyone in the family agreed. In this letter dated December 22nd, 1920, from Joy Morton's son Sterling to the director of the Arnold Arboretum, Sterling was inquiring about establishing an arboretum. His letter begins with, "Can you advise me in the enclosed stamped and addressed envelope where I may secure some books on the Arnold Arboretum? I am particularly interested in the organization and provision for the maintenance of the gardens and their administration. In other words, the business end of it." A few weeks later, Sterling sent another letter to Charles Sprague Sargent, who Joy Morton had met 50 years prior. About halfway to this place, Mrs. Harold McCormick has given a large tract of land for a zoological garden, which has been accepted by the local authorities, and work will shortly start on the improvements. Sterling continues, "There is doubt in my mind, however, as to the usefulness of an arboretum so far removed from the center of the city. That is, Would it be sufficiently accessible to give enough pleasure and benefit to enough people to make it worthwhile? A few days later, we have Charles Sprague Sargent's reply to Sterling's concern about the Arboretum's location. His letter was dated January 19, 1921. In this letter, Sargent says, "It does not seem to me that 25 miles is too far from the city for an arboretum. Chicago is growing rapidly, and before the trees planted now have reached anything like their full size, the Arboretum would be a suburb. The distance from the city has the advantage of giving you air free from smoke and protection from the severe winds from the lake. Have you ever discussed this matter with Mr. Charles L. Hutchinson?" As we can see, Sterling is not dissuaded by Sargent's advice. In his letter to his father, dated March 29, 1921, Sterling writes, "The more I think about it, the more sure I have become that it will fail in its greatest usefulness if it were located as far away as the farm, particularly with the very poor transportation facilities there are. You and I think of the accessibility to the farm in terms of a 7-passenger automobile and concrete roads, but the greater part of the people who would go to the Arboretum are not so fortunate as to possess touring cars, and the prospect of a walk from either Lisle or Glen Ellen would be enough to keep many of them from going. I understand that you wish the Arboretum to be of particularly educational value, and the chief users of it would therefore be students of arboriculture or forestry. I believe the percentage of them who will have automobiles is very small." And Sterling continues, "The ideal location would seem to me to be somewhere along the Des Plaines River, perhaps near the new McCormick Zoo. You know the Bronx Zoo and the New York Botanical Garden are contiguous, and each is able to contribute to the other, both as an attraction for people and in general plan of beautification and development." Joy's response, dated April 12, 1921. "I don't agree with you about not putting Arboretum at Thornhill. It is the only place for it, and there it must be. I want something to develop during the balance of my life on grounds for which I have a personal affection, and I hope the work may prolong my life. So you see, I have a selfish motive as well as an altruistic one. If it's a good arboretum, enough people will find it, even if they have to walk from the railroads." As you probably already recognize, Joy Morton's vision for the Arboretum prevailed. After Joy's letter to Sterling, the work of the Arboretum begins. This photograph is dated June 18, 1921, and in it we meet Charles Hutchinson, Joy Morton, and Charles Sprague Sargent. Joy Morton was engaging these advisors and others to help him create the Arboretum. We've already heard a bit about Charles Sprague Sargent, but who was Charles Hutchinson? He was a prominent business leader and philanthropist who is best remembered today as the founding and longtime president of the Art Institute of Chicago. Hutchinson had previously been in contact with Sargent about starting a botanic garden in Chicago. Things began to move quickly forward with the creation of the Arboretum. The indenture establishing the Arboretum was signed on December 14, 1922 by Joy Morton, close family members, including his son Sterling, along with several executives from Morton Salt. In this document, he outlines his vision for the Arboretum, a great outdoor museum arranged for convenient study of every species, variety, and hybrid of woody plants of the world, able to support the climate of Illinois. Such museum to be equipped with an herbarium, reference library, and laboratories for the study of trees and other plants. Progress during these early years was remarkable. From digging of Lake Marmo with horse and mule in 1921 to the planting and development of the Arboretum. According to notes from Clarence Godshaw, in 1922, we planted 138,000 trees and shrubs. Many of these were planted in nurseries as we had no plants to work with. The permanent plantings that were made were located by oral direction from Mr. Simons. Some of the plantings existing today were parts of Spruce Hill, Hemlock Hill, Pine Hill, landscaping around Lake Marmo, around the Marmo Spring, and from the present Route 53 bridge south along the river and around the lake, which is fed from the river. Looking at this photograph will give you some idea of what the Arboretum looked like during those very early years. This photograph is from 1922 and has the caption of Joy Morton watching spring planting. O.C. Simons on the left was the first landscape architect hired by Joy Morton. A designer in the Prairie School style, Simons hired a young landscape architect and recent graduate of the University of Michigan, Clarence Gottschalk. Gottschalk was soon hired by Mr. Morton as superintendent at the Arboretum, and after Mr. Morton's passing, became the director of the Arboretum. For me, some of the most interesting photographs from these early Arboretum days include Joy Morton gazing upon some of the Arboretum developments. If I could draw a little bubble over his head to capture his thoughts, I suspect he would be thinking something like, "Hurry, keep planting, hurry." So through the collections of the Sterling Morton Library, we see how the Arboretum has changed through the years, from the digging of Lake Marmo in 1921 to a few years ago with visitors enjoying a springtime walk around it. From May Tilgard Watts, who was brought to the Arboretum in the late 1930s to begin a series of teacher education programs, which led to Mrs. Watts teaching classes, launching our environmental education programs, and inspiring so many people to learn about nature, to today's programs of learning and engagement offered to thousands of students each year, learning together and exploring new places at the Arboretum. From our very first Arboretum building to welcome visitors, the Arboretum Center opened in 1935, to the Visitor Center complex designed by Arthur Myram. Although intended to open for the Arboretum's 50th anniversary in 1972 and the 100th anniversary of Arbor Day, this visitor center opened to the public on April 15, 1973. To the visitor center that we know of today, this visitor center was designed by David Woodhouse Architects. The project took over several years as part of the Branching Out campaign and was completed in 2004. From Ray Schulenberg's painstaking, meticulous efforts to plant the prairie in the early 1960s, to the Schulenberg Prairie that we know and visit today. Science and research at the Morton Arboretum has changed, from Clarence Gottschalk with Webster Crowley studying Dutch elm disease in the 1950s, to Lane Shear, a former member of the Center for Tree Science and undergraduate research fellows, collecting pollen from a drone in 2017. To soil test plots at the new Gateway to Tree Science in 2018. I would be remiss if I didn't include the development of the Sterling Morton Library and how we share knowledge and information at the Arboretum. From Joy Morton's original library at Thornhill, now known as Founder's Room, to a small library in the administration building, to the Sterling Morton Library, completed in 1963 and designed by architect Harry Weiss, from a collection of rare books acquired through the years, butterflies and moths captured over a century ago, to Acorn, our digital asset management system, where you can search and explore our special collections 24/7, 365. Through the years, trees have grown. Roads have changed and widened. Lakes have been created. Hedges and evergreens have been planted. And after almost 98 years, the trees have grown. At the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned my thanks for your membership in the Morton Arboretum. Through your support, you've helped us expand our horizons, explore new adventures, learn from others, inspire the next generation, and never stop looking up and beyond. Whatever we face in the coming months and years, since 1922, we continue to recognize the critical importance of trees. The mission of the Morton Arboretum is to collect and study trees, shrubs, and other plants from around the world, to display them across naturally beautiful landscapes for people to study and enjoy, and to learn how to grow them in ways that enhance our environment. Our goal is to encourage the planting and conservation of trees and other plants for a greener, healthier, and more beautiful world. And I'd like to extend my thanks to you for your contributions, for your support of the Arboretum, and for attending this perennial partner event today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you on the grounds at some point in the library using this glorious Arboretum. Thank you so much.